Charterflug in die Vergangenheit.
Charter flight into the past.
Als sie zurückkamen aus dem Exil,
When they
drückte man
returned
ihnen
from
eine Rose
exile,
in die Hand.
a rose was pressed into their hands. The motors went silent.
Auf dem Flugplatz in Tegel.
Reconciliation took place at the airport
Die
in Tegel.
Nachgeborenen begrüßten die Überlebenden.
The successors greeted the
Schuldlose
survivors.
entschuldigten sich für die
The
Schuld ihrer
innocent
Väter.
apologized for the guilt of their fathers.
Als die Rose verwelkt war,
When the rose had
flogen sie
withered,
zurück in das Exil
they
ihrer
flew back
zweiten, dritten
to the
oder
exile of their
vierten
second,
Heimat.
third, or fourth home.
Man sprach wieder Englisch.
English
Getränke
was spoken again.
verwandelten sich wieder in Drinks.
Getränke became drinks again.
Als sie sich der Küste von Long Island näherten,
When they
sahen sie
approached
die
the Long
Schwäne
Island
auf der
coast,
Havel an sich
they saw
vorbeiziehen.
the swans on the river
Und sie
Harbour
weinten.
pass by, and they wept.
Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Zuschauerinnen und
Ladies
Zuschauer
and
vor den
gentlemen,
Bildschirmen.
guests
Ich
in
freue mich
front
sehr,
of
Sie zur
their
Eröffnung der
screens.
Ausstellung Charterflug
I'm
in die
delighted to
Vergangenheit
have the
erneut aus der
chance to
Wandelhalle
welcome
des
you to the opening of
Abgeordnetenhauses
the
von Berlin
exhibition
begrüßen zu dürfen.
Charter Flight into the Past
Trotz
from the
der
gallery of
Einschränkungen,
the
die wir
Berlin
aufgrund
House
der
of
Corona-Pandemie
Representatives.
erleben,
In spite
haben
of the
wir
restrictions
zu meiner
because
Freude
of
eine
the
Möglichkeit
coronavirus
gefunden,
pandemic,
diese
we
wichtige
found a
Ausstellung dennoch
way,
präsentieren
and
zu
I'm
können.
glad we did, to show
Das
this
Thema ist mir ein
important
besonderes Anliegen
exhibition.
und spielt auch hier im
The
Abgeordnetenhaus
matter
in
is something
unterschiedlichen
that is
Projekten und
close to my heart
Veranstaltungen, wie zum
personally, and
Beispiel
it
beim
plays a role
Jugendforum
here at the House of
Denkmal,
Representatives
eine
in
große
different
Rolle.
projects and events. For
Diesmal
instance,
geht
the
es
Youth
allerdings
Forum
nicht um die
Denkmal.
Erinnerung an diejenigen
This
Menschen,
time,
die im
however, it's not about
Nationalsozialismus verfolgt
remembering
wurden.
people
Es stehen vielmehr
who
die
were
Erinnerung
persecuted
dieser Menschen
in,
selbst,
under
die
the
früher
Nazis.
Bürgerinnen und Bürger der
Rather,
Stadt
the focus
Berlin
is on the
waren und
memories
durch die
of the people themselves who used to be
nationalsozialistische
Berliners
Verfolgung in
once
Exil vertrieben
and
wurden, im Mittelpunkt.
were forced into exile.
Der Berliner Senat beschloss am
And
10.
by the
Juni
Nazis.
1969 unter
On June
Vorsitz des
10,
damaligen regierenden
1969, the
Bürgermeisters
Berlin
Klaus Schütz
Senate, under
diese
former
Menschen zu
Governing
Berlin
Mayor
besuchen
Klaus Schütz, determined
Im
to
August
invite
desselben
these people
Jahres
to visit Berlin.
traf bereits der
In
erste
August
Gast
of the
im
same year,
damals
the
geteilten
first
Berlin
guest
Mit dem
arrived in
Besuchsprogramm
what
des
was then
Berliner
divided
Senats erhielten
Berlin.
Menschen, die früher
With the
einmal
invitation
in dieser
program
Stadt
of the
gelebt
Berlin
hatten,
Senate,
erstmals die Gelegenheit
people who had
zurückzukommen.
formerly lived in the
und Berlin
city
zu besuchen.
were given the opportunity to return
Wie wir uns
to
auch
Berlin
eben
and
das
visit their former home.
gehörte Gedicht von Hans Saal mit dem gleichnamigen Titel Charterflug in die Vergangenheit von
The
1979
poem by Hans
gelesen
Saal
von Udo
with
Same
the
vermittelt.
same title,
dies
Charter
gewiss
Flight into
eine
the
sehr
Past from
emotionale
1979
Erfahrung für die
conveys,
Besucherinnen und Besucher.
this was surely a very
Zwar
emotional
verbanden sie mit
experience
der Stadt
for the
Berlin freudige
visitors.
Momente ihrer
Although they
Kindheit,
had fond
aber
childhood
auch
memories of
schmerzhafte
Berlin,
Erinnerungen an Ausgrenzung,
they also associated the city with painful memories of being ostracized,
Sie hatten die
deprived of their
Verfolgung und die
rights and
Ermordungen von
persecuted.
Millionen Menschen des nationalsozialistischen
They had
Deutschlands
survived the
überlebt.
persecution and murder of millions of people under the Nazis in Germany.
Die
They had
Reise in
survived
die alte
Holocaust.
Heimat beinhaltete zeitweilig
The Germany
auch
to
einen
their
Empfang
past
durch das
home
Abgeordnetenhaus von Berlin. Teilnehmerinnen und
temporarily
Teilnehmer sollten vor allem
included
die
a
Gelegenheit
reception
haben,
by
die
the Berlin House of
gegenwärtigen Verhältnisse in
Representatives.
Berlin kennenzulernen
Participants
und ein neues,
should be given the
eigenes
opportunity
Urteil
to
über die
get
Stadt
to know contemporary Berlin and form their
Vieles
own
hatte sich
new
verändert.
opinion about the city.
Die Ausstellung
Many things had
Charterflug
changed.
in die Vergangenheit zeigt die
The exhibition
verschiedenen
Charter
Facetten
Flight
des
into the
Besuchsprogramms
Past
im Wandel der Zeit.
highlights the different facets
Fokus
of the
stehen hier
invitation
besonders
program
die
as it
Biografien
evolved
derjenigen
over time.
Menschen,
The exhibition
die sich aus den
centers on the stories of those
unterschiedlichsten
people
Teilen
who
der Welt
came
auf
to
den Weg
Berlin
nach Berlin gemacht haben.
with a
Die
program from
Ausstellung
all over the
beleuchtet
world.
damit ein wichtiges Kapitel, die Geschichte
The exhibition
Berlins in einer
shines a light,
bewegenden Zeit.
hence, on a crucial chapter, the
Charterflug in
chapter
die Vergangenheit
of Berlin's
verdeutlicht
history
uns
in the
einmal
turbulent
mehr,
times
dass
post-war.
dieser Teil
Charter
der
Flight into the
Geschichte,
past
in dem
brings home to
Ablehnung,
us once
Hass
more
und
that this part of
Stigmatisierung
history,
maßgeblich waren,
when rejection, hate and stigmatization ruled, must never again
auch in
repeat
heutigen
itself.
Zeiten lesen und hören wir noch viel zu
Today,
oft
again, we hear and read
in den Nachrichten.
about xenophobia
Sollte
and
uns wachrütteln,
violence
denn es
in the
zeigt,
news far too often. This should act as a wake-up call because it shows that right-wing extremism and radical views are still widely there, and it poses a threat to our peaceful coexistence. Only recently we had to find that current political issues in the Middle East give rise to anti-Semitic resentment. We have and we want to counter this tendency more vigorously in the future than ever. To this end, it is important to keep history alive and to bring it to one's mind time and again. I'm grateful that with this opening today we can continue to do so, and I'm delighted that with the contributions by Edzard Reutke and Joe Dunthorne, we can get an intergenerational insight. But before we get into that, I'd like to say thank you, especially to you, Professor Dr. Tuche from the German Resistance Memorial Center, and Ms. Schieb, Dr. Schottmann, and Ms. Falk from the Silent Heroes Memorial Center. Further thanks to the Senate Chancellery, and namely you, Mr. Kruger, whose effort was fundamental to this exhibition. Last but not least, my thanks go to you, Mr. Dunthorne, for your contribution and your studies on your grandmother's past. Before we will see parts of the documentary Edzard Reutke, Beine wie ein Storch by Dirk Schäfer, greeting remarks from Edzard Reutke, which I'm very thankful for, and short remarks from Joe Dunthorne, and an introduction to the exhibition by Barbara Schieb and Martina Vogt, I'd like to ask Professor Tuchel to take the floor. I wish you, the audience, a wonderful opening, and of course, new insights, and an interesting event. And thank you very much for your attention.
Sehr geehrter Herr Präsident, lieber Herr Wieland, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren. Mr. Wieland, ladies and gentlemen, now after the speaker's welcome, I now have the pleasure to give you a brief introduction to the exhibition showcasing the Senate's invitation program in its 50th year of existence in terms of what it shows and how it is organized. The exhibition is called Charter Flight into the Past. It is named after a poem by Hans Saal, which you heard before. It's based on the historical facts and the lives of participants in the program. In his poem, Hans Saal, who was born in 1902, speaks of the second, third or fourth home of many refugees. All of them returned to their first home here in Berlin. It also highlights how participants themselves experienced their visits in 5 decades, the significance for the city of Berlin and our culture of remembrance. Now, the first program was launched not at the initiative of the federal state of Berlin, but of those who were once persecuted. Essential ideas came from Hans Steinitz, who had fled from Berlin and who was editor-in-chief of the periodical Aufbau, published in New York. This was then carried on by the spokesman of the Berlin Senate, Hans-Peter Herz, who had been a forced laborer under the Nazi regime, and he had a Jewish father. Now, the former governing mayor, Heinrich Alberts, was also involved in the program. He had been involved with the resistance movement of German Protestantism during Nazi Germany, and a further impetus came from the sports club Bar Kochba Hakua, who wanted to celebrate its 70th anniversary in Berlin in 1968. But let's again recall the figures. 80,000 Jews from Berlin had to leave the city after 1933. In all cases, they were forced to emigrate. They never did so voluntarily. Now, what is even more distressing, more than 55,000 Berlin Jews were deported and murdered after the fall of 1941. Now, based on their own experiences, and given that many of their family had been murdered, It was not self-evident for the former refugees to come back to Berlin, but making the move often led to surprising experiences that breathed new life into their relationships with Berlin. This is why the exhibition starts with the experiences of persecution and immigration, of displacement, and rebuilding life from scratch. It then goes on to explain how the decision was made to launch the invitation program. Now, of course, the magazine Aktuell is part and parcel of the program because it keeps the contact of the former Berliners to their former home city alive. It gives them news and brings them in touch with current affairs in the city. Now, after the news was out about the program and spread by word of mouth, there was keen interest in the program. Even in its first year, many more people registered than expected, but we shouldn't forget that doing this trip was a difficult move for many, because many people had conflicting emotions about it. Now, there were mixed feelings about being happy to be back, but also disillusionment, because sometimes it was impossible to find their former, the apartments where they had lived. And many even had a skeptical reaction. But a special highlight was always when people managed to find friends and relatives they had lost sight of for many years, and in some cases which they feared would have died. But many people were also positively surprised about the warm welcome they were given and about the easygoing lifestyle of this city, which bore no resemblance to Berlin under the Nazi era. But not in all cases the experiences were so positive. Many people were distrustful of the Germans, especially during the first years of the programs, when older people you would meet on the street belonged to the generation who bore direct responsibility for the crimes of the Nazi regime. There was one visitor from 1995 who said, "I somehow always imagined that anyone I met in Germany could be someone who had tormented or maybe even killed my sister or my father." But the warm welcome given by the program staff and the many volunteers, of course, went some way to alleviate those fears. Some visitors, however, regretted having come back to the city of their birth, where they had experienced so much suffering, and which, in some cases, brought back unpleasant memories, which they had suppressed. Many visitors thought that this was a balancing act. Those who were formerly ostracized came back as grateful visitors. Some only came back once, but others managed to build a completely new relationship with the city. Berlin has reason enough to be grateful to all the visitors. They made an invaluable contribution to our culture of remembrance, to the memorial centers, but they also gave an impetus to many young people in the city, the young generation. Now, what is remarkable, and we also can be grateful for that, is the fact that many of them still identified as Berliners, which was something they had rediscovered or hadn't lost. This is a sentiment that is expressed in many letters. Now, of course, the relationship with Germany as a whole was more ambivalent. People were afraid of anti-Semitism and right-wing extremism, and this is obviously still relevant, as President Wieland just pointed out. Just to give you a few names, Margit Friedländer, Helga Melmet and Walter Frankenstein decided to tell their life stories by visiting schools to pass on what they had experienced to the young generation. Now, the second section of the exhibition focuses on the life stories of these visitors from the past 5 decades. And this selection was made based on the variety of the exile countries and the circumstances under which they had to flee, and it makes no pretense to being complete. Here, we want to tell the very personal stories of persecution, flight, and immigration before highlighting the experiences visitors had on their visits to Berlin, and the relationships, the contacts they formed, and their work for the remembrance culture in Berlin. Many visitors helped to build or expand memorial sites in Berlin. They gave interviews as contemporary witnesses, which in some cases was difficult for them. They gave photos, they donated photos, family documents, or heirlooms. Some even bequeathed their estates. We cannot overestimate their contribution to the educational programs at the memorial centers. This was not self-evident at all, and we have to be very grateful for their contribution. And here, today, I would like to express my profound gratitude on behalf of all Berlin memorial sites. Now, ladies and gentlemen, such an exhibition can only be organized as a team. The German Resistance Memorial Foundation followed the suggestion of the Senate Chancellery to honor the 50th anniversary of the program. Claudia Schoppmann, Barbara Schieb, and Martina Vogt worked with meticulous care and great empathy to put together the exhibition, and the graphic designer Tina used her wonderful skills to give the material presented here the respect it deserves. It was a great pleasure to oversee this project in collaboration with the Senate Chancellery. Special thanks go to Regina Kaiser, Christian Krüger, and Amelie Müller, who spent much time and effort to make it a success. And of course, it is a great pleasure for us to see this exhibition again here at the Berlin House of Representatives, and I would like to thank the speaker, Mr. Wieland, for this. Without the input of many visitors, it would have been impossible to set up this exhibition. There are too many of them to mention them all by name, but we are, of course, profoundly grateful to all of them. Ladies and gentlemen, despite the coronavirus pandemic, I can only warmly recommend this exhibition to you. It shows the significance this program holds for Berlin, both for the city of Berlin and for its visitors. The visitors came back to a city which had expelled them. They came back to a city where the murder of millions of European Jews was organized. They came back to a country where only few Nazi mass murderers were held responsible for their crimes. Now, we can only be grateful for this incredible feat, for the willingness to open their heart to Berlin. This is why we pay tribute to everyone who came back to Berlin. And this exhibition is a token of our gratitude. And now I'm delighted to hand over to Edzard Reuter, first with some excerpts from the film Legs Like a Stork, which sheds light on his family's exile in Turkey. In the 1930s and 40s, he lived in Turkey, where he met the Merzbacher family, who had also had to flee Germany. Dorothea Merzbacher is also shown in the exhibition, and both Edzard Reuter and the grandson of Dorothea Merzbacher will shortly speak to us.
Mein Vater war als Sachverständiger im türkischen Wirtschaftsministerium eingestellt, aber auch er musste sich nun plötzlich in eine völlig ungewohnte Situation einfinden. Nach 1-2 Jahren erst hat sich das dann eingespielt und er hat das Gefühl gehabt, ja, ich kann mich jetzt verständigen, es werden auch Anregungen aufgenommen. Er war einer der wenigen deutschen Hochschullehrer, die in die Türkei engagiert worden waren, die die Vertragsbestimmung erfüllten. In den Verträgen stand überall drin, der Herr Professor sowieso verpflichtet sich, nach 3 Jahren Türkisch zu unterrichten. Das hat keiner gemacht, mit ganz wenigen Ausnahmen. Eine der Ausnahmen war mein Vater. Aber er hatte andere Angewohnheiten, die, sagen wir mal, manchmal mit Schmunzeln oder mit Erstaunen in der Türkei angesehen war. Eins davon war er fast berühmt, er pflegte mit seinem Fahrrad von zu Hause in die Hochschule zu fahren, eine ganz erheblich lange Strecke. Er war ein begeisterter Fahrradfahrer, er stammt aus Ostfriesland, da fährt jeder Mensch mit dem Fahrrad immer rum. Und das hat er mitgenommen und mitgebracht. Aber für einen türkischen, man sagt es auf Türkisch, einen Hoca, einen Lehrer, gehört sich das eigentlich nicht, sich so, und er hatte dann auf dem Fahrrad an den Beinen Knickerbocker, so eine Überfallhosen an, er hatte auf dem Kopf eine Baskenmütze. Ein türkischer Hoca oder ein Effendi kleidete sich formal, hatte Krawatte an, einen dunklen Anzug, dunkle Schuhe, und die Schuhe wurden säuberlich beim Schuhputzer immer geputzt und so, das gehörte eigentlich dazu. Das hat er nicht gemacht. Und so ist er dann auch in den Lehrsaal gekommen. Wenn ich mich recht entsinne, ist er sogar einmal nicht ermahnt worden, aber doch sozusagen angesprochen worden, lieber Herr Reuter, ob das so ganz, und dann hat er glatt gesagt, meine Schüler verstehen mich schon. Und das war das Wichtigste. Ich habe mich in meinem ganzen Leben immer wieder gefragt, warum es mir eigentlich erspart worden ist, nationale Überheblichkeitsgefühle zu entwickeln. Es ist ja, können das ja heutzutage ganz besonders registrieren, dass überall wieder in vielen Ländern dieses Gefühl entsteht, wir sind als dies oder jedes Land besser als alle anderen. Ich habe so ein Gefühl nie empfunden, sondern ich habe immer eigentlich verstanden, dass wir bei aller Vielfalt doch letzten Endes alles Menschen sind. Mit den gleichen menschlichen Problemen, mit den ganzen menschlichen Glücksgefühlen. Und ich bin immer wieder darauf gestoßen, dass das mit meiner Jugend in der Türkei zu tun hat. Dass ich hier unmittelbar, jeden Tag, im täglichen Leben, auf dem Markt, im Kino, wo auch immer, gemerkt habe, dass es Menschen gibt, die ihre Tradition haben, die ihre Sprache haben, ihre eigene Kultur haben und trotzdem zum Schluss alle einer Gemeinschaft angehören. Und das ist, glaube ich, etwas, was eines der Geschenke ist, die mir in der Türkei zuteil worden sind.
President of the Berlin House of Representatives, Professor Tuchel, ladies and gentlemen. Ever since I received the exhibition catalogue, I've been captivated by this exhibition. This is not about simple abstract stories, it's about meeting and encountering individuals, people like you and me, with their personal stories. And it is hard, very hard, to become witness to their suffering in such a palpable manner. The fear that came closer, that captivated them, of the Nazi barbarism, the certainty that in the end only escape would save them, losing their friends, their profession, the city, and then the pain of farewell, and then having to start a new life abroad, where you don't know anything. But the fate of the many people we get to know in this exhibition makes the exact opposite come to life as well. The warm-hearted sympathy when they re-encountered their long-lost home, their melancholy when they think back to irrecoverable losses, and the young years in the streets of Berlin, its meadows, forests, lakes. One of them, whom I will never forget personally, was the one and only Hans Saal. This exhibition owes its motto to him. And I quote, "They saw the swans on the river Havel pass by and they wept," unquote. I could also weep when I go through the catalogue and see others that were dear to me once. Dorothea Brandner, formerly Doro Merzbacher, a fellow pupil from Ankara. How long did we sit together at the dinner table with our memorable teacher, Doris Kudret? She taught us and presented us with the entire grammar school curriculum with her unforgettable way. Doro's older brother, Euge, was the one who later introduced me to infinitesimal calculus, the foundation for my later mathematics studies in Berlin. With the other families that had been displaced from Berlin, we spent weekend outings in the surroundings of Ankara, out in the steppes. We met Anatolian peasants and their animals, who, with their hospitality, invited us for a glass of tea in their poor huts. All of this shaped our lives. My own life, not less than Doro's and Eugen's life. Just as all the others that the exhibition remembers and honors. Without any exception, they were convinced to never return back to that country that had displaced them. Just as them, we should remember all those who decided after the end of Nazi barbarism to return, in spite of all the difficulties, and make sure that what happened back then may never happen again. I remember from my exile in Ankara, Georg Rode and Ernst Hirsch, whom the Freie Universität, Berlin and the city owes so much, or Paul Herz, who returned from New York and as Senator for Finance helped to ensure that Berlin, in the difficult post-war period, became a place of freedom again. And last but not least, we should, especially today, remember all those who, because of terrible events in their home countries, have found refuge here in Germany, to live amongst us as free people. Over the 5 decades, under the invitation program, Berlin has changed very much. But it has also made a tremendous achievement and committed to these people who were unable to find their own old lives back in their former home. I'm very grateful indeed that the German Resistance Memorial Center remembers those days with their exhibition.
Ihnen zusammen zu sein. Vielen Dank an
Hello, it's wonderful to be with you today. I would like to thank Edzard Reuter for his gripping words, and thank you also to Speaker Wieland and the Berlin House of Representatives for the invitation to speak here to you today. Now, I'm only a beginner in German, so I'm going to stop speak German now and switch to English.
So hello, I am the grandson of Dorothea Brander, née Merzbacher. And you just saw a photo of her and Herr Reuter together in Turkey in a horse-drawn carriage in the late 1930s. As well as very slowly learning German, I've been very slowly writing a book about her life and that of her family. She was born on Monday, the 14th of April, 1924 in Berlin and grew up in Oranienburg, where her father worked as a research chemist. He made charcoal filters for gas masks, as well as Doramad, a radioactive toothpaste. My grandmother brushed her teeth with it every day. The packaging promised sparkling teeth, radioactive brilliance. It's worth mentioning that in later life, her teeth caused her endless problems. In Oranienburg, Dorothea and her brother Eugen had what she called a very free and easy kind of childhood. They cycled as a family, played with their friends, and went swimming in the River Havel. It wasn't until the 30th of January, 1933, that their life became, in my great-grandfather's words, ungemütlich, uncomfortable. Hitler had become Chancellor, and his supporters marked the day by attacking Jewish shops on Bernauer Strasse in Oranienburg. My grandmother was 9 years old. Her parents no longer allowed her to walk alone through the town. The director of her school, Professor Katz, promised her that she would be treated no differently to any other child. He was still flying the black, red, and gold flag of the Weimar Republic above the school, telling the Parent-Teacher Association that he would not lower it at the request of, in his words, any association of goat herds. A few weeks later, a group of men in SS uniforms arrived at the school, burned the flag, and raised the swastika. From then on, each morning, Dorothea stood in silence while her fellow students saluted and sang anti-Semitic songs. In March of that year, a concentration camp, the first in Prussia, opened in an old brewery around the corner from their apartment. Before school, they would hear the shuffling step of the prison squads who were led past their windows early in the morning. Meanwhile, her father's job was under threat. His employers, the Jewish-owned Our Gesellschaft, was being Aryanized. In 1935, his bosses arranged for his departure. He was to become an overseas employee, setting up a gas mask factory in Ankara. On October the 4th, 1935, the night before they left for Turkey, my grandmother's older brother, Eugen, now 14 years old, was saying goodbye to his first girlfriend, Martha. She lived in the flat downstairs. Martha was also Jewish, and she too would soon be making her own journey out of Germany, ending up in Melbourne, Australia. But for now, the two of them were together in Eugen's bedroom, where, in his words, we lay on my bed in the dark and smooched. His parents had no idea what he was up to. The next day, the family left their home in Oranienburg and travelled first to Munich and then by sleeper train to Vienna via Salzburg and Linz. They spent a few hours in Budapest, but only saw Belgrade from their beds. Serbia was too hot. Bulgaria had good trains. Finally, they arrived in Istanbul, and in a letter to his cousins, the Kitzingers, Eugen wrote that he immediately loved the city. He particularly liked the old town, felt that he would learn Turkish quickly, and wrote, "Für den Kaffee und die Zigaretten kann ich loben, sie sind wirklich beide ausgezeichnet. I can speak highly of the coffee and cigarettes, they are really both excellent." Which, for a 14-year-old, is quite a statement. I wonder if he was really as cool and confident as he makes himself sound. In Istanbul, they crossed the Bosphorus, leaving Europe behind, and boarded the Anadolu Express sleeper train to Ankara. Before going to bed that night, they watched the Marmara Sea drift by, the fishing villages along its shores. By the morning, the scenery had changed completely, and the train steamed through a seemingly endless, flat landscape of sand, stones, brush, occasional mud huts, sheep, goats, and not much else. Having travelled 3,000 kilometres from Oranienburg, they finally arrived at the new capital of modern Turkey, Ankara, then only a city of 120,000 people, a world away from cosmopolitan Istanbul. This would be their home for the next 14 years, and they would forever be thankful for the security and kindness that was offered to them by the Turks. In Ankara, they lived in a small community of around 30 German-speaking families. Many of the adults in the group were eminent Jewish scientists, academics, and musicians who had been forced to leave Germany. These individuals helped establish the University of Ankara, as well as the Classical Music Conservatory, both of which continue to thrive today. For the children of these families, there were definite upsides to living among such talented individuals. My grandmother had violin lessons with Gilbert Bach, a German Jewish musician who had been first violinist of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra from 1925 to 35. We do not know how this great virtuoso felt about teaching scales to a 12-year-old. Dorothea trained in millinery at a high school for girls, but after graduation found that she was not allowed to work in Turkey. Her German citizenship had been revoked in 1940, and she was unable to get Turkish citizenship. Her brother had better luck. At the university in Istanbul, Eugen studied physics under a number of brilliant German-speaking scientists, many of whom were refugees like him. It was said that the best German university in the world was now in Istanbul. After the end of the war, Eugen got a scholarship to Harvard, which was the beginning of a brilliant career as a physicist. My grandmother, meanwhile, met my grandfather, Donald, a Scot, 22 years her elder. When they married, she got British citizenship, which was, in her father's words, very clever of her. Donald worked for the British Council, and over the next decade, she and he lived all over the world, in Bratislava, Göttingen, Tehran, Milan, Reykjavik, before they settled in Edinburgh. There she got a degree in social work and started working. She lived in Edinburgh for the last 50 years of her life. In 2007, Dorothea and her brother Eugen both returned to Berlin at the invitation of the city, this being the first of 5 return visits to Berlin and Oranienburg. They saw their old apartments, or what was left of them, visited their former schools, and talked to young Germans about their experiences. On these trips, Dorothea and Eugen always brought one of their children or grandchildren with them. In this way, the journeys were not just about their returning to Berlin, but also about re-establishing a relationship between Germany and our family. Last year, my sisters, my mother and I began the process of being renaturalized as German citizens. I admire the use of the word renaturalized. It implies the restoration of a previous relationship, not the start of a new one. These long-standing connections feel important, particularly now. Exhibitions like this one remind us to see beyond the borders that divide us, to see past labels like refugee, and locate our common humanity. Nowhere is really home to me, Dorothea said, near the end of her life. Where do I come from? She was not a sentimental person. She would not want the story of her life to end with neat closure or catharsis. She herself was full of contradictions, capable of being funny and warm and brutal and spiky, often all during the one game of Scrabble. I know that she would be very glad to see this exhibition, to have her experiences so powerfully remembered. But I also know that she would be the first to comment on what had been missed out or got wrong. I can only imagine what funny and damning things she would say to me, having listened to my attempt to squeeze her whole life into a 10-minute speech. I wish she were still here to say it. Thanks very much.
So, thank you very much, Joe Dunthorne, for this impressive speech, which brought your grandmother really close to us. And believe me, we would have loved to invite her. But we wish you all the best for your forthcoming book. And we're going to continue with your grandmother's story for a moment. Ja, guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Wir danken Präsident Wieland sehr für die Möglichkeit, diese Ausstellung noch
Ladies
einmal
and
hier im
gentlemen, first
Abgeordnetenhaus
of all, I'd
zu
like to say
zeigen.
thank you to
Mein Name ist
Mr.
Martina
Wieland,
Vogt.
the President, to show
Meine
this exhibition
Kollegin
here
Barbara
at the
Schieb
Berlin
und
House of
ich,
Representatives
wir
again. My name is Ms. Funk. My colleague Ms. Schieb and I are here at the House of Representatives in the gallery, and as the curators of the exhibition, we would like to guide you through what is being presented here. Dorothea Brander, who in 2007 came to Berlin first, maintained relations with the city, and in 2012 she gave an interview for the website First of All, I Am Human by the Anne Frank Center in Berlin. In this interview, she was asked, "What is your notion of home?" She pondered this question and thought of all the different aspects. And then she said about German Jewish emigrants, and I quote, "I think there are many people like me who are uprooted." Unquote. This term of being uprooted is what we took up when we formulated the guidelines of the exhibition. And we first of all asked about the process of how those persecuted by the Nazis were uprooted from their home and how their home was taken from them. Then we asked about their lives under, or rather between different identities in the exile countries. We asked about their experiences when they visited Berlin and were physically confronted with their past and their persecution. And last but not least, we asked ourselves to what extent they would tie in with old relations in Berlin, whether they were able to do that, or in what way they would make and form new roots and forge new bonds. It was already said that the focus of the exhibition was on the biographies of the visitors, and what is clear that those trips were an emotional adventure whose end was entirely unclear and quite unexpected for some. We will now show the exhibition panels of Dorothea Brander. Once again, here you can see it. This is one of the 9 biographic panels of the visitors in 5 decades. In addition, the exhibition is composed of an exhibition table with 7 units of the program, of the invitation program, part of which is of course, the side of the Senate. This table is framed by 1 showcases that includes presents people brought for their hosts. Those were chosen from more than 35,000 visitors. We tried to showcase a wide array of different stories, different daily lives, different ages. The oldest one was born in 1877, the youngest one in 1938. We show different conditions, escape conditions, different experiences in the exile countries, and different activities that were undertaken during their visits or later on. All of this was only possible if we had documents and photographs. On this note, I'd like to thank all of those who supported us, especially those people and their descendants. They were very keen to provide us with material and take us and share the history and the stories of their families. We'd like to thank them very much indeed. Without them, this exhibition would not have been possible. We are not only showing the invitation program after 1969, but also the persecution process in the 1930s and 40s and the framework conditions of the escapes. Let us be mindful that under the terrorism by the Nazis, more than 360,000 people fled abroad. Among those, 300,000 people of Jewish origin, which was 2/3 of German Jews at the time. Almost 80,000, as Professor Tuchel said, came from Berlin, which is almost half of the Jewish community back then. A picture showing Bremerhaven in 1936, emigrants bidding farewell. This picture might suggest that everything went orderly. In fact, escape circumstances were dramatic. Often they were a result of years of desperate work and efforts. Immigration rules were very, very strict. Just think of the International Refugee Conference in Avignon in July 1938, which sealed the strict policy by all of the states. But also in Germany, the process was accompanied by exploitation and impoverishment. People were threatened with poverty in the exile countries too, especially because they couldn't choose where to go, but especially after 1938, refugees had to take what they were offered. This means they were always in a forced situation. It wasn't really emigration, it was really escape. Under the Nazis, nobody really strived for reinventing themselves abroad, starting a new life, with the exception of perhaps a few Zionists who wanted to emigrate to former Palestine. But even those who, after the war, after they had managed to survive persecution, even when they emigrated, they did so by force, because it was unthinkable for them to continue their lives in Germany. Even after they left Germany, they weren't safe and protected from persecution. Many of them were deprived of their citizenship. Mr. Dunthorne mentioned this. This was an extreme violation of the duties of a state towards their citizens. You can see the file card of Dorothea Merzbacher here from the German embassy in Ankara. You see the red writing on the file: expatriated, passport seized, and citizenship revoked. As a consequence, the emigrants were stateless in their exile countries. Dorothea Merzbacher, for instance, she did not find work in Turkey despite her training as a seamstress. This social downward spiral is being showcased past pro toto by a picture of Helmut Jurecka in the kitchen of his new home in Quito in Ecuador, where his family fled in 1939. The family had given up their very modern flat in Berlin Brits, and you can see the sharp contrast at first sight. What might have been an adventure for 15-year-old Helmut going to America, as you can read in many of his letters, but for the parents it was a fight for their livelihoods. Every day they tried to find work but didn't succeed. Many also tried to make for a living within the community of the migrants, the local migrants. Here you can see a picture of the family Haas in their shop in Shanghai. It looks like a small grocer's shop, but it was rather a possibility or an opportunity rather, to offer European food to the other migrants. We know these shops from many other big cities in Germany from other migrants. But of course, there were opportunities as well. This is especially true for those who went and moved to former Palestine to build a Jewish state. Helmut Jureschke, who we saw in the kitchen in Quito, for instance, emigrated to the US in 1940. He settled very well there, so that, like Eugen Merzbacher, for instance, he was able to study physics at the University of Harvard and became a physicist. This picture shows him as a lecturer in 1955. Not least because of economic problems, the first country of exile didn't remain the last. Many emigrants had to fend for themselves in different countries. These escape routes can be seen here. This shows the different stations the people had. Here you can see the escape routes of the family Haas. They fled to European neighboring countries first, which were often the first stop, but because of German expansion policy and the refugees were no longer safe in these countries. Some of them, not all of them, managed to escape again. Those who didn't manage became victims of Nazi socialist, National Socialist crimes in their exile countries. So far, we spoke about all of those who managed to escape in the 1930s, but many didn't succeed to escape. After the war started in 1939, most of the escape routes were blocked. In October 1941, Jews were banned from leaving the country. They were hence prisoners in the country of their persecutors. We also show the stories of the people who were only able to emigrate after 1945, after surviving imprisonment in the concentration camps, like Margot Friedlander. But even after the ban on immigration, some of them tried to escape. This exhibition shows the stories of Leonie and Walter Frankenstein, Walter Johansson, and Margot Friedlander. They tried to go into hiding in Berlin, and thanks to the help of many non-Jews, they were able to survive in hiding. Mr. Johansson, who was 20 back then, managed to hide in Berlin, and in part thanks to the support from Margarete Heilmann. She was the widow of the persecuted and later murdered SPD party parliamentary group leader Ernst Heilmann. And I say that because we are here at the former Prussian parliament where he used to work. Margarete Heilmann hid Walter Johansson together with others, and thanks to her, he came in contact with some escape helpers to neutral Switzerland. Illegally, in other words, without any approval, he fled in September 1943 from southern Germany to the Swiss canton of Basel. Together with a helper, a supporter, he waited during the night and went through the River Rhine in the night. they were lucky that they were able to get into Swiss land so far that they didn't get caught. And because people that were caught in the border area could have been repatriated. The picture on the right shows him in 1995 at a hotel in Berlin when he was guest of the Berlin Senate. My colleague Barbara Schiep took this picture, who sits next to me. And Walter Joson back then gave us a biographic interview which can today be found at our foundation, Silent Heroes. This was 1995, and in 2017, when a research project between Swiss and Germany benefited hugely from his interview and could have been put to good use. Now I'd like to give the floor to Barbara Schiep, because she herself used to work for the invitation program as well, temporarily.
Es ist schwer, eine Ausstellung, die Sie nicht sehen können, in Worte zu fassen und Ihnen nahezubringen. Ich möchte anknüpfen an das, was Professor Tuchel in seinen Eingangsworten erklärt hat und Ihnen kurz die Bilder dazu zeigen, wie das Programm überhaupt angefangen hat. Und ich glaube, es ist kein Zufall, dass es Akteure waren, die selber die NS-Zeit als Verfolgte erlebt hatten und in Regierungsverantwortung waren, und zwar in den 60er Jahren. Es waren nicht besonders viele hier in Berlin, aber die wenigen, die es gab, die haben dann dazu geführt, dass es einen kurzen Beschluss gegeben hat, wie Herr Tuchel schon gesagt hat. Der Senatsbeschluss fiel am 10. Juni 1969. Der Vorlauf hat ungefähr 1,5 Jahre vorher begonnen, und zwar mit den Akteuren Heinrich Alberts. Das waren die Ursprünge des Programms. Und wir sehen die beiden, Heinrich Alberts links, der Senatssprecher Hans-Peter Herz, Heinrich Alberts als bekennender Kirchepfarrer inhaftiert gewesen während der NS-Zeit. Hans-Peter Herz als sogenannter Mischling fiel unter die Verfolgung der NS-Behörden und musste für die Organisation Arbeit verrichten. Die beiden verstanden in der Nachkriegspolitik ganz genau zu wissen, dass die NS-Zeit eine ganz entscheidende Rolle gespielt hat in ihrem politischen Handeln. Ein Jahr später, als Klaus Schütz dann regierender Bürgermeister war, kam es dann relativ unkompliziert und unproblematisch zu diesem Senatsbeschluss. Es wäre nicht so komplikationslos gewesen, vonstatten gegangen, wenn nicht ein Emigrant, der zwischen den Welten hin und her pendelte, eine zentrale Rolle mitgespielt hat. Von der anderen Seite, nämlich der Journalist Hans Steinitz, der selber aus Berlin geflohen war, nach New York ging und dort den Aufbau, das einzige deutschsprachige Organ gegründet hat und dort von diesem Beschluss und von den Ideen dazu berichtete. Das heißt, in dem Moment, wo der Senatsbeschluss beschlossen worden ist, stand die ganze mediale Aufbereitung schon im Aufbau. Das heißt, die ganze deutschsprachige Community in dieser Zeit hat davon Kenntnis gehabt, hat sie rezipiert, hat es aufgegriffen. Und die Sorge, die der Senat damals hatte, wie kommen wir denn eigentlich zu den Leuten, wie erreichen wir sie, wie können wir sie einladen, von wem wissen wir denn, wen wir einladen müssen, das geschah automatisch dadurch, dass die Menschen sich an den Senat wandten und sagten, ja, ich möchte kommen. Und der Ansturm war sehr, sehr hoch. Wir möchten auch darauf aufmerksam machen, dass noch ein Akteur eine kleine oder vielleicht größere Rolle gespielt hat, dass nämlich der Tel Aviver
actors was also involved, namely the Bar Kochba Hakwa Sports Club, who had been founded at the end of the 19th century in Berlin. They wanted to celebrate their 70th anniversary in Berlin, and the Bar Kochba Hakwa Sports Club contacted the Berlin Senate whether it wasn't possible to have this celebration in Berlin. And here you can see a photo of them in 1969 when they were the first group to visit Berlin under this newly launched program. And the governing mayor, Klaus Schütz, received them at the seat of government on the 1st of, or in August 1969. Now, apart from the groups that came to Berlin on a visit, there were also individual visits, and the first of them was Robert Rosen, a survivor of the concentration camps. He had been liberated in 1945. Now here you can see a picture from the Welt am Sonntag newspaper. It shows him visiting the Potsdamer Platz, the border between the East and West Berlin. It shows him at a spot where you could look above the wall. And on the right-hand side you can see the Senate official who took care of the invitation program and who led Mr. Rosen through Berlin. Now, I think this picture speaks volume. On the left-hand side, you can see Robert Rosen, who is rather skeptical. He has his arms crossed in front of him. And on the right-hand side, you can see Mr. Kowalski, who looks away to the distance. So you can see that maybe the relationship wasn't as warm and cordial as you would have expected. And Mr. Rosen had an incident a couple of years before where he had to change planes in Frankfurt, and he refused to leave the plane because he didn't want to set foot on German soil. And but after his visit to Berlin, his attitude changed. He wrote letters where he was appreciative of the efforts of the Berlin Senate. So I think this represents the change of mindset that happened for many people, many of the visitors who came to Berlin. And unfortunately, we cannot show you the pictures of the other visitors. But here you can see a photo of the first group of the sports club. They stayed in Berlin for a week. Now, the program was basically always the same. There was an invitation by the governing mayor, there were sightseeing trips, visits to memorial sites, to exhibitions, boat tours, at the invitation of the Berlin House of Representatives, and there were even members of the Berlin Parliament who used this opportunity to talk the former emigrants, the former refugees. In the evening there would be concerts or musicals or visits to the theatre. But people also had an opportunity to visit their former residences, the place where they lived or where they went to school. And I don't want to forget the former pastor Sigrid Lericke, who came from a Protestant family in Berlin, and she got involved in the program because she realized that people only talk to the officials, to government officials. And she initiated invitations to Berliners' homes. She had a network of personal contacts of around 200 people who were ready to receive the former refugees to their homes over coffee and cake. And I myself could see and hear and listen to the the visitors on Monday mornings when they raved, when they were very enthusiastic about the Sunday afternoon they had spent at Berliners homes. Now, in March 1970, the invitation program was transferred to the Senate Chancellery. It got its own division. It was located at Hardenbergstraße, and in 1991, this division moved to the Red Town Hall, where it is still located, and the heads of division had a committed staff, committed team, who were very skilled and very competent, but also warm-hearted and were very passionate about their work. Now, each year there were 3 big groups who came to Berlin, and plus individual visitors. In the anniversary year, 1987, when Berlin marked its 750th year of existence, hundreds of visitors came to Berlin. In 2010, the group visit program ceased operations because there weren't many groups anymore left who wanted to come to Berlin, but the individual visits continue up until today, and more than 35,000 visitors came to Berlin over the course of time.
But we're not already at the end. The last picture we saw showed one of the group activities that were always part of the program, the boat trip. But over time, the invitation program changed, even though roughly many things remain the same, well-established procedures or patterns. At the beginning, the radius of the visitors was limited to the groups and the team at the Berlin Senate. But over time, individual interests gained importance. Contacts beyond the invitation program were made. Early on, visitors said they would like to meet representatives of the younger generation in Berlin. Some of them went into schools and talked about their stories, their story of persecution. Like Professor Tuchel said, the skepticism about the older generation prevailed. These encounters became more frequent over time. Margot Friedlander, for instance, until only recently gave talks at schools. Last year she turned 99, and if the pandemic wouldn't have stopped her, she would probably still do it. This photo shows her in 2018 with an international group at the Berlin State Central Office for Political Education. Margot Friedlander is no longer a visitor. In 2010, she decided to move to Berlin permanently, and ever since she has lived in our city. In 2018, she received an honor, becoming Berlin's honorary citizen. Other visitors, too, especially later on in the later years of the invitation program, tried to create their own projects, going into schools or supporting research projects. Professor Tuchel mentioned it. His center benefited greatly from the visits, but they also engaged in projects in certain neighborhoods in Berlin. There are many stumbling blocks in Berlin that were laid by visiting former Berliners. Others contributed to art exhibitions or other things, so that they have left traces in our city. What was also important to many is to visit former places of their former lives in Berlin. Many were disappointed if their former home was no longer there. Others were lucky and were even able to get in contact with Berliners who now lived in their former homes, like Helmut Jurecke, who visited his former home in the Berlin Hufeisensiedlung. On the left hand, you can see a picture of him and his sister in this house in the 1930s, and on the right, you can see him with one of his daughters and his partner. Sitting in this very same place, and he was lucky because the family who lives in the house today invited him so he could see the house interior once again. He even found the apple tree his father planted back then. So for all those who get in touch with today's Berliners, had the chance to, this meant coming to terms with history in a different manner. And these, of course, are the most exciting aspects of this program. Besides the encounters with foreigners, some focused on finding old friends. Barbara can say more about this.
Genau so ist es. Es war
Yes, that's true.
unser Ziel, wieder Begegnungen auch in der Ausstellung
we had
zu
the
zeigen.
aim
Alles das, was durch das
to
Programm
show
und durch das, was die damals
what happened when
Emigrierten und
the former refugees came back to Berlin
der Stadt auch wiedergegeben hatten.
and what they contributed to the city. The Frankenstein family, which we can see here on a photo from 1991, on the left, Walter Frankenstein, right, on the right, Leonie Frankenstein, both of them had two children born in 1943 and 1944, and they survived the Nazi regime. In the middle, you can see Edith Hirschfeld, who protected them, who hid them. Now, they had lost sight of each other, and they didn't have any contact anymore. And Walter Frankenstein came back to Berlin in the 1970s as part of the invitation program, and he met Hans Rosenthal, who you know from German television. They were both in an orphanage during the Nazi era, and they survived the regime. They met again through the invitation program. Now, 15 years later, they came back to Berlin when they met Edith Hirschfeld, their savior. And they were overjoyed because they had lost sight of each other. Walter Frankenstein immediately applied for Edith Hirschfeld to receive the distinction Righteous Among the Peoples. And she received this honor in 1993. Leonie Frankenstein died in 2009, and Walter Frankenstein started a late career as a contemporary witness. He was involved in many projects, visited many memorial sites, attended street renaming ceremonies, and he also kept alive the memory of the Auerbachsche orphanage, the Auerbach orphanage. He visited Berlin many times as part of the program, and sometimes he wasn't even aware of where he was when he was at Savoy. Am I in Stockholm or in Berlin? Well, let's say I'm in Stocklin or Berholm. That was his motto. And outside of pandemic, he would still continue to travel, of course. Unfortunately, he's in Stockholm at the moment. Daniel Dishon is another visitor who came to Berlin at the end of the 80s. He was forced to emigrate to Palestine in 1933, and he was forced to leave his parents behind. His parents were deported and murdered in Auschwitz in 1943, and all he could take with him was the engraving made by his father. And when he returned to Berlin in the 80s, he was keen to find out where the artistic works of his father were, what had happened to his artistic legacy. Much of it had been destroyed by bombs, of course. He talked to me for a long time, and after many years, we managed to trace the drawings. Some of them had been published in a newspaper at the end of the Weimar Republic, and this led to an exhibition in Neukölln, new publications, and many contacts were established between Berlin and the family in Israel. There were Stolpersteine, those brass-plated cobblestones that remember the victims of the Holocaust. And when he died, his daughter told me that he had a photo on the wall of those brass-plated cobblestones at Viktoriaplatz here in Berlin. Now, another project is the sculpture which I would like to briefly show to you. This sculpture is called Reconciliation, which all visitors which one of the visitors gifted to Berlin on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of the invitation program, by Hans Enschede, and he was so impressed by the invitation program that he was convinced that reconciliation is possible. Now, you can see that this sculpture represents an embrace, or intimates an embrace. This sculpture was set up at the Wilmersdorf and inaugurated at the Wilmersdorf Town Hall in the 70s. Now, of course, this is a long time ago. The sculpture still stands in its place, but it is in dire need of restoration. And if anyone is interested in restoring, we are happy to receive suggestions. Maybe we can find even a better place for this sculpture that is more dignified.
So, ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, we would like to show a picture that is not part of the exhibition. It shows Helga Melmet before the exhibition panel dedicated to her when the exhibition was first showed in 2019 at the Red Town Hall. She had come for the second time at the invitation of the Berlin Senate from Florida. She gave an interview with the AP when she said, as an Auschwitz survivor, having lost two parents in the Holocaust, she would have thought it inconceivable when she emigrated in 1945 to ever return to Germany. In 1977, she did, in fact, take part in the invitation program, however, with very mixed feelings about it. In 2019, in the interview, she said, "I didn't know if this trip was a dream or a nightmare." After she returned in 2018 to Berlin, and now in 2019, when she came again, there was a shift. She then said, "I have reached a conclusion in my relation to Berlin. It no longer hurts." Unquote. So the invitation program was sometimes a facilitator for healing. And those who worked for this program for years, volunteers and those who were employed at the Senate, without knowing perhaps and without intention, they had followed the Jewish concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world, and they owe thanks for that. Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to thank you for your attention. We hope that you like the exhibition, that you have the chance to see it in person. Many of you will possibly not be able to see it in person now, but we will point out how you will be able to get the catalogue. Thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, guests at home, I'd like to give thanks once again to all those involved, once again, who made this exhibition at the Berlin House of Representatives possible. I'm grateful for the insight, the information, and the impressions we were provided today, and which we should keep in mind. I was very impressed by this evening and touched, and I do hope that you liked the event and that it touched you too, and I wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you very much indeed.